Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. A potential fight between Dillian White and Andy Ruiz Jr. dead in the water, Ruiz Jr. saying he's moved on, and predictably Dillian White has responded saying that Andy Ruiz Jr. didn't want any smoke and he didn't want to fight him. So I'll get to their statements and then on to a few thoughts, because I never expected this fight was going to get made. If anything, the publicity has been great for Andy Ruiz Jr. in the wake of his loss to Anthony Joshua. And there's one man standing for Dillian White now out of the original three that he named as prospective opponents for his next fight, and that is Alexander Povetkin. We will come to that as well, and I always thought that was going to be the guy. We will get to that and a few thoughts on that potential fight, because seemingly that will get made very soon. But starting off, so Andy Ruiz Jr., here is his post. He has Dillian White, a picture of him after he was knocked out by Anthony Joshua. Ruiz says, "You didn't want any smoke, so I moved on to the next opponent. Big announcement coming soon." And below that, here is a comment from one of Andy Ruiz Jr.'s team. He says, "They made a BS offer to fight in the UK. Let's get this bag and keep it in the States," at Andy Ruiz Jr. And predictably as well, Christopher Lovejoy, who calls out anyone and everyone in the heavyweight division, is calling for a fight with Andy Ruiz Jr. So I did have a chuckle at that, because he's always doing that on Instagram and social media more broadly. So this for me was quite predictable. I didn't think this fight was going to get made, and Andy Ruiz Jr. gets out in front of Dillian White. He gets out first and says that White didn't want any smoke, so he says he's moving on, etc. And part of the reason I think that he was moving on was the deal wasn't going to get made. He wanted to get out before White came out in public and started torching him, because White had already been doing that after the first offer, saying that he'd been eating too much chocolate and tacos and all that sort of stuff. And White's response also on social media: "No smoke, typical coward move from fake Mexican Andy Destroyer, a blob rolling away from a big payday. You're all stomach and no heart, and more Mexican than you. And the can man, if you want it, you can get it. Hashtag anytime, anywhere. Hashtag can man." And that's Dillian White's response to Andy Ruiz Jr.'s statement from about a day before. So pretty predictable, and this is the sort of stuff he would have been saying regardless of Ruiz and his statement. He would have said it if Ruiz Jr. had been silent and said nothing. So it would have been that similar sort of rhetoric. And actually, two Dillian White managed fighters are in the comment section below this. So Alan Babbage, he says he had just one great fight in him, bro, no more. And also Fabio Wardley, they're all talk. So the fight dead in the water. But all this publicity has actually been quite good for Andy Ruiz Jr. I didn't think he was going to take the fight, and there were a few reasons for that. One of them was, I think he wouldn't have allowed Dillian White to be the A-side. Let's face it, Dillian White making offers, they were going to look to have a pay-per-view in the United Kingdom. White would have been the A-side in this sort of fight equation. It would have been White-Ruiz, not Ruiz-White. So I think there would have been the whole A-side equation that was a potential sticking point, but also Ruiz, after getting millions upon millions of dollars, an 8-figure payday for the rematch with Anthony Joshua, he would have been looking for A-side money. And that would not have been offered. We did hear there were two offers that were made. Potentially there could have been more, we don't know. But the first offer was a 7-figure offer. The second one was an improved offer on that. We don't know the exact specifics, but at least over $1 million or £1 million, whatever it was actually that was offered to Ruiz. But it wouldn't have been the A-side money that he was looking for. And I think Ruiz Jr., another sticking point for him, he would have wanted the fight in the US, not the UK. But realistically, this fight makes money in the UK, not in the US. It could have been a good fight on DAZN, for example, because if they looked to take it to the US, it probably would have been on that subscription service. But the real moneymaker for a Dillian White fight is in the United Kingdom, where he's got a bigger fan base. It wasn't going to make nearly as much money in the US, in my view. Dillian White is in the Dillian White pay-per-view business. This is sort of a resumption of, recent pay-per-views where he's fought Derek Chisora, Joseph Parker, Oscar Rivas, all on pay-per-view all in the UK. This was going to be a Sky Sports pay-per-view, and that's where the money was really going to be made. But yeah, so that wouldn't have suited Andy Ruiz Jr. I think, along with the A-side status that he would have wanted, the A-side money, he would have wanted it in the United States. Remembering, he was trying to get the original rematch with Anthony Joshua in the United States, not Saudi Arabia. But when his deal was sweetened, all of a sudden he fell into line with the Saudi Arabian fight. And we can't forget now as well that now that he's a much more established name, that PBC probably want to use that on their own networks, Fox or Showtime, as opposed to farming him out. Realistically as well, was he going to be ready? Obviously, he weighed 283 pounds for the rematch with Anthony Joshua, and now he's without a trainer. There's some talk he may go with Teddy Atlas. They may try that out. I don't think that would work. I think Teddy Atlas is a disciplinarian that Andy Ruiz Jr. would end up eventually hating, and he would go off the rails. I don't think that would work long term. Maybe for one fight, but I don't know, with no sort of setup in place at the moment as it stands, if he was going to be ready for a late April or early May fight. Yeah, I mean, you could make a case that he could, but at the moment, he's probably more than 283 pounds, judging on some of the recent photos that have come out and videos on social media of Ruiz Jr. He says he's got the hunger back, but which hunger is he talking about? But also, something to actually consider here. Was he really ever entertaining this? You know, for all the reasons I've just outlined. I mean, another one to consider is that this has been some profile, you know, for Andy Ruiz Jr. at a time where his stock has been at almost an all-time low with fans. He's a much higher profile fighter now, but after his excuses and statements after the rematch with Joshua, coming in 283 pounds and saying he didn't train hard, he was skipping sessions and yada yada yada, saying he could have won if he trained hard. Is this just actually something that's taken some attention away from that sort of stuff? The talk of a White fight. I think it's been good to keep his name floating out there with fans. Good profile stuff. And he probably should be actually thanking Dillian White for talking about him and a potential fight with him, because it has taken fans' minds off his recent loss to some extent. And I think a lot of fans were quite looking forward to a potential Ruiz and White fight. And in my view, it's actually not a great style matchup for White, but I'm just not convinced it was ever really going to happen. And I'm sure the offers were real, that, you know, Matchroom wanted to organize a Ruiz fight, but at the right price and at the right conditions. And I'll come to that later, because as I sort of mentioned, Dillian White calls himself the can man, but it's probably more accurate to call himself the caveat man. We'll come to that later. But Ruiz hints that something big is coming. And we ask the question, well, what is it? And I think the two names that sort of stand out for me as, you know, logical options to return in what would be a decent fight is Luis Ortiz and also Dominic Breazeale. And on the Ortiz front, I think that just makes a lot of sense. Ortiz coming off a loss to Deontay Wilder. Wilder had spoken about wanting to face Andy Ruiz Jr., and that was not necessarily just if he won against Anthony Joshua in the rematch, but in the PBC stable of the guys who Wilder has not fought, Ruiz is one of the bigger names now, and if Deontay Wilder continues to win, there's going to need to be, you know, a lineup of opponents for him to face. And I know some fans believe that Fury will beat him and that Fury will take the WBC title, but if he doesn't, they will still need to keep the production line of potential opponents coming. And Andy Ruiz Jr. is potentially a good name for Wilder to face at some point in the future, as is, say, Adam Kovnatsky. He's already faced Luis Ortiz twice, but if Andy Ruiz Jr. fought Luis Ortiz and beat him, then I'm sure Deontay Wilder would make a case that, you know, he'd gone through Ortiz, the boogeyman of the heavyweight division, as Wilder keeps calling him, and he would say, yeah, I want to fight you. And you may find that he would look to sneak in a fight before potentially facing Dillian White in 2021, if he's still got the titles, and there's no guarantees about that. There is a third fight potentially for the loser of Wilder and Fury on February the 22nd. There is a double rematch clause in place that can be triggered. But Ortiz and Ruiz, it makes a lot of sense. It's a good in-house fight at PBC. And don't get me wrong, I mean, I think some people in recent videos have thought that I'm against in-house fights. Not the case at all. If it's a good, meaningful in-house fight, I don't mind it at all. I think Ortiz and Ruiz is a very good in-house fight. And another one that would also make some sense is Andy Ruiz Jr. and Dominic Breazeale. I think that fight has the potential to be a real barn burner, but it's also a very winnable fight for Andy Ruiz Jr., perhaps more so than the Luis Ortiz fight. And a lot of people have sort of mentioned a bit of disappointment in regards to Breazeale because they thought he was potentially being lined up to face Charles Martin. And if he's not facing Martin, because Martin's now facing Gerald Washington on the Wilder Fury 2 undercard, who's he going to be facing next? And it would make some sense for Breazeale and Ruiz. That would be a real barn burner, a real war, or even Breazeale Ortiz. I don't mind that either. I think they need to match Breazeale against some of these guys because, I mean, now that he's had that title shot against Deontay Wilder, no one probably needs to see him in lower level fights. He's just got to have decent fights. Like some of these other PBC guys, you just have to match them tough. Whoever keeps winning is going to get their way back eventually to another title shot. Maybe not this year, but maybe in 2021. But Ruiz versus Ortiz or Breazeale, I like those fights, especially for a return fight. And I could totally see the narrative being sort of weaved that if Ruiz beats Ortiz, then he could potentially be in line to face Deontay Wilder at some point. So as for Dillian White though, Alexander Povetkin is the last man standing. And I always believed that this was going to be the guy that White was going to be facing as soon as his name was mentioned, along with Otto Wallin and Andy Ruiz Jr. If you followed the channel, previous videos have mentioned that I didn't think that an Otto Wallin and Dillian White fight would end up doing great pay-per-view numbers. Similar to the Oscar Rivas fight, I think it would have been those sorts of numbers, which was lower than the Chisora and also Joseph Parker fights. Significantly lower, about 25-30% lower in terms of pay-per-view buys. And I don't think they would want to risk putting him on pay-per-view for the sort of money that White wants against Otto Wallin. It would have been a decent fight, but I think the financial considerations certainly would have come into it. And I'm sure they did want Andy Ruiz Jr., but they would want him to be the B-side and taking B-side money. Whereas a guy like Alexander Povetkin has been working with Matchroom in the past couple of years, a number of fights. He's fought Hughie Fury, David Price, Anthony Joshua, of course, in a title shot in 2018. He has shown that he can work with them, and I don't think he would be nearly as demanding as Andy Ruiz Jr., and he probably would be willing to take the B-side status in a fight with Dillian White. It's going to pay him a decent amount. He's 40 years old. He's still got some, credit within the division, a top 10 fighter, but he is at the back end. He certainly is a guy for Dillian White at least. He's a beatable opponent where he can still have a good event, make some good money, and still beat a guy like Alexander Povetkin. Not without risk though, but I do think Alexander Povetkin versus White makes more pay-per-view buys and money overall than a fight with Otto Wallin. That's why I think Wallin falls out of the mix there. They wouldn't want to dip down back to Oscar Rivas numbers if they could help it. So Povetkin probably being an easier fight to negotiate, to me it always felt like that was the logical option. And it's about this time that I'm sure there'll be some comments, well, Luis Ortiz, he's 40 years old, like Povetkin, why isn't Ortiz in the conversation here? And my view on this is I don't think Dillian White's going to be doing anyone like Luis Ortiz any favors. Deontay Wilder has actively used, Luis Ortiz as a bit of a shield for White not to get a fight against him, saying, if you fight Ortiz, then you can have a shot against me. But Dillian White has sort of railed against that, and he even walked away from an eliminator in 2018. So I don't think he's going to be doing Ortiz any favors now that he's the WBC interim champion and also the mandatory challenger. Why would he realistically want to give Ortiz a shot to have another title shot against Deontay Wilder? And no one wants or needs to see Wilder Ortiz 3. Although, stranger things have happened. Maybe we could end up seeing that at some point, especially if Ortiz wins and gets some meaningful wins. But I think the talk of him facing Luis Ortiz, maybe if it was a year ago, that would be more realistic and viable. But it's not. And he ain't going to do Ortiz any favors at this point. So I think that sort of talk about that fight, that's dead and buried now. We're not coming back to that. I think that's just what it is at this point. But Povetkin, we've seen he is on the decline now. 40 years old. He has some good rounds in him, and then he does sort of fade a little bit. He does tire, although it was a very fun and entertaining fight against Michael Hunter. I actually thought Povetkin shaded that, but I wouldn't have cared who won either way because it was a close fight, and ultimately it was a draw. And because it was a draw and he didn't lose, that keeps Povetkin's stock up, So he's there to be, had in a fight like this by Dillian White. But the key thing is Dillian White needs to actually go in there, be in shape. He can't be that 270 plus pounds as he was against Mariusz Wach, because that is a recipe for disaster. He will lose against Povetkin if that version of White shows up. But in terms of opponents, White calls himself the can man, and I sort of referenced this earlier, but I really think it should be the caveat man, because he is in the Dillian White pay-per-view business, and now that he's cleared all this UCAS stuff, people have warmed back up to him for the most part. But he wants to be in the Dillian White pay-per-view business and resume that. He wants to be the A side. He wants to get the bulk of the money, and that it's going to be a pay-per-view in the UK under the conditions that are dictated by him and his promoter, Matchroom. So I think fighters at a certain level will accept that. For those reasons, what I've just outlined, I think Andy Ruiz Jr. was never going to take the fight. So it was never a surprise to me that fell over. I didn't think it was going to come off. But Povetkin, yeah, I totally think he will just, acquiesce to some of the demands. He is there for the good fights, and I believe that he probably thinks he can beat Dillian White. And it is actually a good fight, but if White catches him with a left hook, Povetkin can be hit, he can be hurt, he is on the decline. But because he is a fading fighter, although still a top 10 name, he's beatable. But it's a good opponent for White, as would any of these other guys that I've mentioned. Wallin, Ruiz, Ortiz, all would have been good fights, but this always felt to me like it was going to be the fight. What do you make of it all? Drop a comment, loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe, follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.